Hello, summer classes. Here we are with Chapter 10. This will be the last of our chapters for our second set of chapters for our second exam. This will be from Chapters 6 through 10, Campaigns and Elections. Some of this material we've covered in some of the other previous chapters, in particular looking at voting behavior and political parties. FOMO for elections, fear of missing out. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those initials there. And it's brought out in your text at the very beginning, as you can see here, that what happens, especially with young people, if you're not voting, you're missing out on one of the most remarkable features of democratic government, as your text mentions. Every few years, citizens are provided the means with which to change the government and select new leaders. So, the importance of voting. Now, we will bring out in this, throughout this semester and some of the other chapters, I think we've talked about it a little bit in some of the earlier chapters, but when we look at elite theory, we'll consider the idea that perhaps voting really doesn't make any difference, that the elites are comfortable with the candidates on the ballot, and whoever wins will continue to answer to the elites that run the government or run the country. And so in that case, it doesn't really matter too much how people vote. Now, that's an interesting theory, and there's some reasons to consider that theory. But in the meantime, it's also then important to consider, do you have some means of making a contribution to the political system? And if it's not through voting, how would that means occur? How would you be able to participate? So it's an interesting segment of the text to review and consider what it means to participate, and then also what it means to not vote. Now, there have been elections that have clearly made some differences in our political system, and they're referred to as realignments. There's also been some occurrences in which we've just seen a large portion of voters move away from the two-party system, and that's a de-alignment. So as we can see here, the party, if you have a two-party system, if you have one party that's been in the majority and now it loses and becomes the minority, and you see the minority party that had been the minority for quite some time and now becomes the majority in an election, you've seen a turnaround in your system. You've seen a change there. If it consistently stays that way, then that election is suggested to become a realignment, that it was a realignment. There's some debate among political scientists on how to really apply this definition and how to review it. But we're going to look at some elections that, for many people who study elections, the conclusion is that it was a realignment. Before we do that, let's just consider again this whole concept of a de-alignment. It's a movement away from the two-party system. And when you have a third-party candidate that is able to gain a considerable amount of support, in this case, Ross Perot, close to 19–20% of the vote, George Wallace in 1968 getting over 20% of the vote, then you really do see some indications that there are third parties that are very strong, and that the support for the two-party system, or one of the two parties in the two-party system, has weakened. And so we have had moments in our political history in which that has occurred. We've seen a de-alignment. The types of presidential elections that we'll cover, there's 3 of them here, and we'll really focus on the realignment. This comes from a landmark book called The American Voter. Angus Campbell was the main author, and really focusing on the behavior of voters in elections. And one segment focuses on presidential elections. Needless to say, in our presidential elections, the number that we've had, most of the time, that the elections are going to follow the same pattern that's been occurring. So you have the same partisan structure that you had before the election afterwards. One party that's been in charge continues to stay that way. some slight variations. If the two parties are very competitive, then maybe there's no real way to show that the outcome of the election made any kind of difference politically in the structure of the country. So that's where most of our presidential elections would be. And generally, we would look at the presidential election as the major type of election in your country. It's when most people vote, and it does certainly have a possibility of changing the leadership in the executive branch. So that would be the election that would be focused on the most. Very rarely you have an election that might be referred to as a deviating election, and this is where you would have one party that clearly is the majority based on membership and winning in most elections and a large amount of the elections. And yet you would have a president that would be from the minority party, was able to win, despite having some disadvantages in the structural arrangement of the two parties. In the 1950s, this was a time in which there were two elections that would fit that pattern as a deviating election in 1952 and 1956, with Dwight Eisenhower winning, despite the fact that the Democratic Party was a very strong political party at that time and was clearly the majority. So Eisenhower was a Republican, was able to win because of his popularity. Republicans had some strength in congressional elections, but still overall would be the minority party. And there has to be something extraordinary that occurs in a deviating election. In this case, the Republican candidate, Dwight Eisenhower, was just personally so popular. That also occurred in 1912 with Woodrow Wilson winning as a Democrat, and the factor there was that the Republican Party was divided. So deviating elections, they don't occur that often, but those are some of the examples. So realigning elections are what we'll focus on here, and some examples of those, where you had one party that had been out of power now becomes the party in power, and really we start to see some changes in our governing system. So when Jefferson won in 1800, the Democratic Republican Party had been out of power, never really had power, and John Adams, being the last of the Federalist presidents, was defeated in his re-election in 1800. It was very important for John Adams to recognize that as a candidate who lost, in this case an incumbent president who lost, he would still step down. And we just take that for granted today, but in the beginning part of our history, there was really no precedent on what to do if an incumbent lost. So John Adams has served a very important symbol for our country in saying, recognize the importance of the election, the importance of the voter, and stepping down when one loses. So that's our first realigning election. 1828, Andrew Jackson, who was a Westerner at a time where the West meant Tennessee, and defeated John Quincy Adams in his re-election. And this is the beginning of the modern Democrat Party that's formed from Jefferson's political party. Then a new political party is emerging in the 1850s, and in 1860 elects its first president, Abraham Lincoln, Republican. And as you can see here, the established political party, the Democrat Party, was divided geographically and over the issues on slavery. And so this also, of course, ushered in the Civil War and considerable changes for the United States. We start to see some urban-rural divide occurring, and also some divides in East and West in the United States with the election of William McKinley in 1896. In many ways, it was a continuance of Republican domination. You had from 1860 until 1912 only one Democrat elected president. But this was a competitive election. A lot of different ideas were being brought out, And so that's the reason why it is also referred to as a realigning election. And then here we can see Roosevelt winning, Franklin Roosevelt winning in 1932. And the Democrats had been out of power for decades. And so this election was a significant one, and how the two parties really traded off their positions overall in the country as one party becomes the majority and the other party the minority. David Mayhew has written considerably about this, one of the top researchers on realignments. And so I think it's worth noting that he thinks there's too much emphasis on this. And so of those 5 elections that I just mentioned, he would really narrow it down to 2 that clearly were realignments, and that would be the 1860 election and the 1932 election. So there's no doubt that we'll consider that all 5 of those are realignments. But if you're really wanting to focus on times in which the country was considerably different after the election, then these are the 2 that would fit that category far more than any other elections in our history, 1860 and 1932. Your text goes into some detail about the differences in some of our recent elections, and I'll add on some other points here about those, which I think are pretty interesting. Now, in previous chapters, we've talked about primaries and caucuses, and the 2008 Democratic campaign for the presidency, for the candidacy to run for president. It's a very competitive race. 2 well-known individuals there. Now they're well-known. Not so well-known at the beginning part of this campaign, but Hillary Clinton against Barack Obama. And notice here that based on the nomination process, within differences among the states, the different processes among the states, that you had different outcomes here. So Hillary Clinton did very well in the primaries, but in the caucuses, where people have to show up at a set time, declare who they'll vote for, Obama does better there. And so he did better by a greater margin in the caucuses than what Clinton did in the margins in the primaries. And that's what helped Obama win the nomination. It was a pretty drawn-out process. We've talked about that when we looked at proportional representation as the way to determine delegations in the Democratic Party, state delegates in the Democratic Party. And so that means that the campaigns generally go on longer, and so that was the case here, starting off in January in 2008, in the official time of nominating a president, selecting delegates, and it went on until June the 3rd. 2008, for the Republicans, you had a very established candidate running for that nomination. That was Senator John McCain from Arizona, and won the nomination by early March. So you had 2 senators, Senator Obama against Senator John McCain. Actually, 3 senators. Hillary Clinton was a senator from New York. Now this is interesting here, a little detailed on what we've seen, but really from 1976 until the nomination of Donald Trump in the Republican Party, he had a fairly consistent process of who would win. So the person who lost the previous campaign would go on to win the nomination in the next time that there would be a campaign for the presidency. And you can just pause and perhaps look that over. I don't go into a lot of detail about this on any test questions, but I do think it's worth noting a very consistent pattern of one of our major political parties for many years when it would come to selecting their candidate. And there were certainly times in which this worked to their advantage, the Republican Party's advantage. Reagan winning, George Herbert Walker Bush winning. So in both those campaigns, it worked for them. Started not to be that successful in some of these other campaigns on selecting the nominee. and then perhaps we'll just see that this process may not really work anymore. 2016, candidate Donald Trump, the first person ever elected, despite never holding elected office or being a cabinet member or a military commander. First time in the history of the United States. Also in the 2008 general election, the process of picking the vice president was one in which there was different strategies involved. Candidate Obama picked a senator from Delaware, Joe Biden, and the primary reason for picking him was his ability to do well in terms of helping strategically in the Electoral College in two key states, Pennsylvania and Ohio. John McCain picked Sarah Palin, who was she was a governor of Alaska at the time, because was a media sensation, getting lots of attention, and was a pick that had not been predicted by most people. And she was able then to get a considerable amount of attention and bring more attention back to McCain's campaign. In the 2008 elections, you can see here the strengths of the two parties, which has been fairly consistent in a lot of elections. So in the middle part of the country, you can see in red the Republican Party. Middle part of the country for McCain and the Republicans. Southeast, in large part, the two coast for the Democrats. Upper Midwest, notice that area, we'll come back to that. And then also Florida. Stayed pretty much the same in 2012. Not much variety there. A little more competitive between the candidates. And this was for President Obama's re-election. I'll just point out, because here in 1896, and notice that was a realigning election. If you look at where the strength would be in those two parties, it's flipped. So along the coast, in the both Pacific and Atlantic, at least the upper Atlantic, that's for William McKinley, the Republican candidate. That became his strong areas in the upper Midwest. Whereas in the middle part of the country and in the Southeast, those were the strong points for the Democrats. So those are two areas in both cases, and you've seen that it's flipped around for those two parties from 1896 until 2008, 2012. 2016, the key to candidate Trump winning the presidency was in that upper Midwest. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Florida. Those four states, extremely close elections in all four, but in all four going for Trump over Clinton, and that was the key to the campaign. And you can imagine that in 2020, that will be the key part of the election. Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. You'll be hearing those four mentioned over and over and over, and throw in one more, and that would be Ohio. So Ohio has been a key since the Republican Party has been in existence, and we've had Republican candidates for president. No Republican candidate has ever lost the state of Ohio and won the presidency. Now, midterm elections are generally times in which the president's party will lose. Only 4 times since 1860 have you seen the president's party actually gain seats in the midterm election. But 2 of them happened recently, when Bill Clinton was president in 1998 and when George W. Bush was president in 2002. So we've had some recent history of midterm elections actually going fairly well for presidents. But the most recent midterm elections have not gone well for the president's party. 2010, so President Obama has been in office 2 years. And the first midterm, does not go well for his party. Key part of this was the enthusiasm gap. As we can see here, the enthusiasm gap is just a way, think about Chapter 6, measuring opinion. You measure the Democrats' enthusiasm, in this case, compared to the Republicans. Just ask people who are registered in these parties their likelihood of voting, likelihood of contributing to a campaign, likelihood of participating in a campaign. And the Republicans were far more likely to do all those than the Democrats, and it was reflected in the outcome of the election. 63 seats lost in the House and 7 in the Senate, so an overwhelming defeat and victory, on the other hand, for the Republican Party. 2014, in many ways some of the same results. Gained 9 seats in the Senate and 13 seats in the House, and there in 2014. 2018, Democrats gained back the House. So you can see that the last 4 midterm elections have been significant for the party out of the White House. And notice in 2018, you had a very large turnout. And this was a very high turnout for young people. We brought that up in some of our other chapters. And so that was a key reason why the midterm elections turned out the way they did. Why people vote the way they do, it has a lot to do with their attitudes about the candidates and what they find to be most important. So if you're a prospective voter, or if you follow prospective voting, then the reason why you vote the way you do is to consider potential outcomes, what you think or what you project the future will be for a particular candidate. Retrospective voting is to vote based on the past record of a candidate. So clearly, if you have one candidate with very little history in politics versus another that has a considerable record, then you see some differences there between prospective and retrospective voting. We saw that certainly in 2008. To some degree, we also saw that in 2016. Now, in terms of money in politics, money in campaigns, a big part of it has to do with this particular court case. It's now 9 years old. The Citizen United case comes back to the idea that the Supreme Court views corporations are like individuals. And if that's as a result of that, then limiting campaign contributions is not something that the government is able to do in most situations. And so it does mean that there's a great deal of money that can be out there in the political system. Again, we've talked about proportional representation. You do see a version of this when it comes to selecting delegates in the state primaries and caucuses, but overall in our national system, we don't really have that. But you do see countries in which you would have a multi-member system, and you would almost always have more than 2 political parties as a result of that. And you can read about that on page 382. So again, some of the differences there with how an election would be conducted to select a candidate and select delegates and within a state, and those are the primaries and the caucuses. We've talked about that in Chapter 9, the differences between open and closed, and the differences between a primary and a caucus. Also, you can read about that on page 382. There's ongoing attempts in many states, including Oklahoma, to eliminate the straight ticket ballot, which would mean that people have a right to just click off one part of the ballot, and it means that they voted for this every candidate on the ballot of one particular political party. That's what straight ticket voting would be. People who vote for candidates of different political parties on their ballot are splitting their ticket. And so we are seeing an increase in the amount of straight ticket voting. But also with the ballot, the whole idea that you can vote and people not know how you voted is a secret ballot. And it's also referred to the Australian ballot. I think it's good for us to make a reference to the country that got that started, and that was Australia. And so the Australian ballot is a ballot where you do not know. You're able to keep how you voted secret, and other people don't have a right to know. And here we can see examples of direct democracy, where people are directly making those changes in the political system, not working through the elected officials. And we see those examples there on pages 392 and 393. All right, our next area of attention will be turned to interest groups, chapter 11. And before we do that, sorry about that, one more point to bring out is the Electoral College, and certainly read about that on pages 389 and 392. A lot of detail to go over here, and so you may want to just pause the screen and be familiar with that area. All right, we'll be moving on to interest groups.